Okay, you can go ahead, Nathalie.
Okay, thank you. Tanse, bonjour, good afternoon, bonjour. Welcome to the live stream format of the fall 2021. Okay. Tanse, bonjour, good afternoon, bonjour. Welcome to the live stream format of the fall 2021 Métis Talks. My name is Nathalie Kermoal. I'm the director of the Rupert Center for Métis Research, as well as a professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory, traditional gathering place for Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. So for those of you who don't know what the Rupert Center for Métis Research does, first of all, like RCMR is a joint venture between the Métis Nation of Alberta, the Rupert Land Institute for Métis Excellence, the Faculty of Native Studies, and the University of Alberta. It's housed in the Faculty of Native Studies at the university, and it's an academic research program specifically geared towards Métis issues. The goals and objectives of the research center includes building provincial and national connections with the Métis community, increasing research capacity to advance Métis-specific research, and training and employing student researchers. Métis Talks are a semi-annual public event in the fall and the spring that highlight Métis-specific research, art, and culture. So today we have two presentations. The first will be with Bailey Oster and Marilyn, Lizee, and the second with Dr. Cheryl Troupe. So we are in a Facebook, YouTube live format because of COVID-19. But what's important to for people to realize is that after each presentation, you'll have the possibility to ask questions. So we're going to have around 15 minutes for questions from the audience to the presenters. So you can ask your questions at any time in the live chat, and they will be relayed to the presenters. As well, a recording of these presentations will be available afterwards on the RCMR YouTube channel. So I'd like to introduce our first presenters, Bailey Oster and Marilyn, Lizee. Bailey is a Métis woman with roots in the Red River settlement and Saint-Paul-des-Métis. Bailey received her Bachelor's of Arts in Sociology with a research focus in restorative justice. She currently works as a manager within the Youth Program and Services Department at the Métis Nation of Alberta. She was elected as the youngest ever vice president of New Dawn, the Métis Women's organization within Alberta, and still currently holds the position. Marilyn Lizee was born in Lloydminster, Saskatchewan. Being a true Métis, Marilyn moved around frequently with her family and finally planted roots on the Elizabeth Métis settlement. After raising her family and enduring many trials and tribulations, she emerged as a strong and opinionated Métis woman who discovered early in life that her passion is helping those who could not help themselves, to be a voice for the voiceless and advocate for the rights of Métis people. Having grown up in a Métis community, Marilyn truly understands what it means to be Métis and the importance of educating everyone about Métis culture. Marilyn has been working with and for the Métis Nation of Alberta since 1996 and is currently the Senior Cultural Advisor. She's also the treasurer of the Métis Local 1990 Grand Prix. As a stalwart advocate for Métis women, Marilyn is the president of the Alberta New Dawn Métis Women Society and represents Alberta Métis women on the national level as a treasurer of the Women of the Métis Nation. This year, Bailey and Marilyn released the book, Stories of Métis Women, Tells My Kookum Told Me, through Derville and Uproot Books. The book has been featured in the Globe and Mail, CBC, Wind Speaker, and the Edmonton Journal, and reached the top of the Alberta bestseller list in August 2021. So today, the title of their presentation is Stories of Métis Women, Tells My Kookum Told Me. Marilyn and Bailey.
Thank you so much, Nathalie. That was a very lovely introduction. I'm just going to share my screen here so we can get a PowerPoint up. Just might take a second. All right. Marilyn, you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. So I know Nathalie already did an amazing introduction, but I'm just going to introduce myself really briefly. So my name is Bailey Oster. I, like Nathalie said, am the manager of regional youth coordinators at the Métis Nation of Alberta. I am originally from Elk Point, Alberta. So that's region 2 of the Métis Nation of Alberta. And I grew up there, but I currently live in Edmonton. And yeah, I love the work I get to do. I get to work with Métis youth every single day. I get to see, youth from ages 12 to 29 come into their own, learn who they are, be proud of their identity and their culture. And, through that work, I get to be part of the Métis community. And then through my work on New Dawn, I get to, meet women from across the province and do amazing things like this book. This opportunity for this book would have never happened if I hadn't, met Marilyn, I think like 7 years ago now, and become part of New Dawn and began to meet women and hear their stories. And yeah, Marilyn, would you like to introduce yourself really quick?
Sure. Thanks, Bailey. Actually, when I first met Bailey, we were both kind of thrown into the political ring. I was invited to a New Dawn Métis Women's meeting, and the night before was asked if I would run for president, and met Bailey the next day, who only came for lunch, and went around and said, I want Bailey to be my vice president, because I truly believe that we need to incorporate the youth in. And so, yeah, that's how me and Bailey met. And it's been a wonderful experience. She's an amazing young lady, and I just love working with her. So I grew up with, my dad was a ranch hand, so we moved around quite a bit. And then we finally planted roots in Elizabeth Métis settlement. So I grew up on a Métis settlement, as well as then spread my wings and moved out. And in 96, started working with the Métis Nation of Alberta. President Audrey Putra at that time was a finance director, and that's how I got to know her. And once she was elected as the president, I circled the executive assistant position and truly believed that that's where my destiny laid and that's what I needed to be. And so that's what I became. So I was with her off and on since 1996. And like I said, I'm a true Métis. I live in Grand Prairie, Alberta, but I work in Edmonton, Alberta. And if somebody was to ask me, where are you from? I would say, what do you mean? I live here, but I'm from Elizabeth Métis settlement, and that's what I consider my home, where my mom is. So I have been the president of New Dawn Métis Women's Association for 2 terms now. And one of our goals is to ensure that our culture is passed on to the next generation. So that's the one of the main purposes, and to be that support group for the Métis women. But so I know we only have a limited amount of time, and I can talk. So, but I would just like to acknowledge Dr. Lorraine Shiba. Sorry, Lorraine, if you're here and listening. She from Derville Publications and Uproot Books. From the first meeting, we would not be sitting here if it wasn't for her and Colette Putra, who introduced us to Lorraine. We sat down, we told her the concept of the book, and she was immediately on board. And so that's where our journey began in writing and producing and editing the stories of Métis Women Tales My Kookum Told Me. And I'd also like to acknowledge President Audrey Patra, who I do currently work for as well. And she allows me to be the cultural advisor, the writer, the organizer. I wear so many hats at the Métis Nation of Alberta. And so she allows me to entail this position as well. And so I would like to acknowledge her. And of course, Bailey Oster she was the backbone of this book. She did all of the hard work and all of the writing, and she's an amazing writer. Crystal Letty, this beautiful, beautiful piece of beadwork that you see here on the screen was created by her. And she tore apart pieces that she had before, and some of the beads that are on here are 100 years old. And so we are so grateful. This is a concept. We told her what we wanted, and this is the concept that she came out with, and that's which is on the sleeve of the book as well. And then, of course, we cannot forget Sky Blue Morin, who translated the book for us into Michif. So there's Cree Michif on all of the stories are translated into Cree Michif, because we feel that it's very, very important that we try to continue, and language is so very important, especially in storytelling and gathering information from our elders. So that's a pretty long introduction. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and I hope you like our presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Marilyn. So for the first half of this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about storytelling and how powerful storytelling can be as a tool. And I want to also preface this by saying storytelling doesn't necessarily have to be through words. I think Marilyn made a really good point and about pointing out, how beautiful this work that Krista did, this beadwork. And I think this art in itself tells a story. It might not be as clear as the words written on a page, but you can look at this and you can see the history of this beautiful artwork and see the story that it tells. And I just want to say, like, storytelling there's not only one way to do it. And that's going to be something that I might talk about a lot, and that recurs through everything that we talk about today. So first off, why are stories important? So for as long as humans have been on this earth, we have told stories. It's always been around, from the first recorded story that we've ever found, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which you see on that stone tablet, to the stories we tell ourselves today about our nation. Jean Taillé recently came out with The Northwest is Our Mother, this book that tells the history of our nation. And stories, whether they're true or fiction, they are important in how we make sense of the world around us. They're not just entertainment. They're not just words on a paper that are, fun to read. They're a fundamental part of being human, and they are how we make sense of the world around us. They situate us in a place and a time and a context within our world and our culture, and they are under how we understand ourselves, our family, our community, and our nation. So I look at stories as one of the most powerful tools we have as humans. We wouldn't have culture, we wouldn't have a history if we weren't able to pass down stories. So I just think the value in stories is so important, and that was one of the main drivers of us wanting to write this book, is because Marilyn and I and all of the other ladies who we work with through New Dawn and that we meet every single day, that we all have stories to tell, and those stories are powerful. So like I said, stories shape how we view the world, but not all stories are treated equally. And there's a really good quote by James Brady, who is was one of the first 5 to create the Métis Nation of Alberta. And he says, most historical accounts of any event differ because it is quite sure, and someone remarked, it is always the ruling class that write histories. Stories are the way we understand and make sense of the world that we find ourselves in. They are how we understand who we are as a people, both on an individual and community level. But history is always written by the oppressor, never the oppressed. So the stories we hear are most often told by the people who won the battles. They're not told by the losers of the battles. They're not told by the people who are being oppressed, the people who are being pushed down. Those aren't the narratives that get out there. So as Métis people, we have a long history of resistance. and story sharing. And there is thousands and thousands of Métis stories that have never been shared, that have never been passed on. So our stories didn't get written down or formally recorded, but we've always had a strong sense of kinship ties. We've always had strong kinship ties across the homeland, across the country. But now there's much more distance between us. So we can't necessarily be telling these stories, between just two people, because we can't gather like we once used to. For better or worse, we have to utilize technology in a way that we've never done before. And that creates a lot of difficulties, that creates a lot of isolation and loneliness, but it can also create a lot of new opportunities. People are able to come to these talks that might not have been able to before. We can maybe connect with people we haven't connected with before. So technology is one way that we can share stories with each other, for better or worse. And it's a big part of how we're going to move forward and how we're going to share our stories with each other and with people outside of maybe Métis communities, people who don't know who the Métis are. We can tell our own story. We can write our own narrative, and not let our story be told by people who aren't us anymore. So stories are gifts that we give to each other. And this happens on multiple different levels. So on a personal level, for both the storyteller and the listener, stories have the ability to both empower and to heal. On a social and community level, stories have the ability to shift perspectives, to build relationships, and to inspire action. And on a political level, our stories about who we are as a people, our histories, have supported us in our fight for recognition, for our pursuit of self-determination and governance, and for our rights as an Indigenous people across cultural, social, political, and economic spheres. Through our stories, we have the ability to change the Canadian narrative, to change the narrative of who we are, to showcase who we are and where we come from. Think about, the histories you learned about the Métis growing up. Think about the stories of Louis Riel, of Cuthbert Grant, of Gabriel Dumont. If their stories had never been passed on, if their stories had never been told, like an old folktale, where would we be as Métis people? If we didn't have that context to think back as to who we are, who our family is, who our community is, we wouldn't be a people. We wouldn't have a culture, because we aren't able to share our gifts to each other. We're not able to teach each other about who we are as a people. We literally right now in our fight for self-governance and recognition and building a constitution, tell the stories that were written down about the buffalo hunt and the giant hunts with thousands of Métis people that would come together. If we didn't have those histories, if we didn't pass down those stories, we wouldn't be able to say today, like, we are a unique group of Indigenous people, because we wouldn't have those stories with us. So as a people, we can do the work to make our stories more discoverable and accessible for both ourselves and for others. So stories give us strength, and I want everyone, I can't really see anyone, I can just see my presentation. So I hope you all do this with me. Just a quick exercise. So I assume a lot of people watching are Métis, but if you're not, use this in the context that it applies to you. I'm just going to give us a few seconds here, take a moment and think about the stories that you were told growing up. The stories, we all grow up hearing family stories or stories from people in our community. Those things that, we think about when we need strength. Maybe it's a story about your grandmother persevering, going through hardship, or your grandpa, your Kookum, your aunties, your uncles, maybe someone 100 years ago who was in your family who persevered. I just want you to think about the first story or the first person that pops into your mind, and think about that person and how they make you feel. So I'm going to give us about 10, 15 seconds to think of that person. Okay, so I want everyone to think about, how do these stories affect you? Maybe they give you strength, maybe they give you knowledge, encouragement, or hope. Stories are not simply a tale from the past, but they are a map. They are a roadmap that will help to guide us into the future. So say you're going through something that's really, really hard, right? Say you're going through a really tough time in your life and you don't know if you can make it through. You don't know if you can persevere and fight through whatever adversity you're facing. Maybe you can think back and say, I remember the story of my grandmother fighting back against, maybe someone who was trying to hurt her, or maybe, someone who was trying to take her down. You can remember that story and you can say, if she can do it, I can do it too. We remember how strong our ancestors are. We remember how strong our community is. Those stories give us strength. They give us hope for the future, and they can guide us into what we want for the future. So, I mean, that's a lot of talk about storytelling, but I think I just don't want people to think that the stories in this book are just for entertainment. I think stories have a lot of power, and they have a lot of really important things that they can bring to our everyday lives and bring to society. So Marilyn and I decided to write this book, Stories of Métis Women, Tales My Kookum Told Me. And we were so lucky to have so many amazing Métis women agree to share their stories with us. So the next slide, I think it's going to go straight into a little video, which is just a trailer to the book. And then once that's done, Marilyn is going to talk a little bit about the book itself and the writing process. And then she's going to highlight some of the women in the book and their stories. So yeah, here's the trailer. It starts. We'll see. Technology.
Kermoal and Uproot Books presents Stories of Métis Women, Tales My Kookum Told Me. In this era of reconciliation, Stories of Métis Women explains the Métis Nation from the women's perspective. We asked author and co-editor Bailey Oster why these stories are important to share.
So sharing the stories of Métis people, and specifically Métis women, is important to Western Canadians and all Canadians, because the Métis were really some of the main builders of Canada. Métis people were a key part of the fur trade, a key part in building our nation, and their stories have so often been left out of that narrative completely.
Often misunderstood, the Métis are an Indigenous people with a unique and proud history and nation. This book celebrates nation building, culture, identity, and resilience, but also deals with the dark times of residential schools, discrimination, and racism. Included in the book are links to a video documentary.
It's really important to self-identify with your Métis heritage. A lot of people might just say that they're Métis, but you need to go back and understand and establish. How far does it go back? Who got Métis script? Who self-identified as Métis?
And many of the stories that are told about the Métis, even today in contemporary society, are of the men. You hear about Louis Riel, you hear about Gabriel Dumont and Cuthbert Grant, but you don't hear about the women. And the women were really the keepers of the family. They built our nation, they built our culture, but they did it in the backgrounds. So we wanted to bring that information and those stories to the forefront, to be able to share them with people. And we hope that this book is successful in doing so.
Ask your local bookseller for Stories of Métis Women, also available to download as audio and ebooks. For more information, go to derval.com.
All right, so that's just kind of a trailer of the book. I like that the recommended video is a brief history of cheese, but that's not part of this presentation. Marilyn, do you think you could maybe now talk a little bit about the book itself and our hopes for it?
Certainly. Thanks, Bailey. That was a great presentation on storytelling, and growing up for me, of course, we always sat around the kitchen table and talked, but we never called them stories. And for me, stories were the storybooks that we learned in school, like in a colonial school. And so sitting around talking about it, we never knew that that's what we were doing, is we were actually passing on our culture to our kids and the people sitting around the table. I remember I learned how to dance without even knowing how to dance, because I watched people at dances, because we were never left alone as kids at home. So on my second term of becoming the president of New Dawn Métis Women's Association, we had Colette Patra come and present to the ladies, and it was about digital storytelling. And so, and Bailey, you can step in here for a bit if you want to and talk about. So it was about digital storytelling, and what Colette did was she created a website for their family, and it was just for them. And then she just recorded people sitting around the kitchen table talking about what they remembered, or the times of the big snowstorms, or who came into their lives and stuff like that. And that's a treasure that Bailey's children and grandchildren are going to be able to sit and watch, because it's now forever stored and forever kept in the digital world. And so after watching that presentation and after the election was over, that was one of my dreams, was to have, we have so many powerful Métis, beautiful Métis women within the province of Alberta that have done so much for the Métis Nation of Alberta, and we need to write down their stories. And so I never ever thought this was going to be a reality. I just thought, we're just this poor little women's association. We get hardly any funding or anything like that. So how are we ever going to do this? But obviously it was meant to be, because we got it done, and we got it published and that kind of stuff. So our that was the main goal, was to ensure that their stories are heard, their stories are captured and written down. And when we were meeting with the lawyer over the contracts and stuff, he said, you know what? He says, you guys should actually record these on video too, because none of us are going to be around here forever, and this is very valuable information. And so that's what gave us the idea to create the documentary as well. And so we're hoping that this book will be a volume 1, and that either somebody else after us picks it up or does it again, or we do volume number 2, because there is a lot of women who in the province need to have their story told. And these are the beautiful women. So do you want me just to read out the names, Bailey, or?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, here, I have to shrink you though. Yeah. or move you out of the way, hang on.
Heard that before.
So these are the 14 beautiful women who completely agreed and thought this was a fantastic idea to come in and to tell their stories. Each one of these beautiful women's stories is different. They can talk about resilience, they can talk about culture. Beatrice Demetrius was the lead head genealogist at the Métis Nation of Alberta. Angie Creer, if you don't know Angie Creer, one day you will get to know her. She is amazing residential school survivor. Caroline Charlebras actually talks about and did a interview with President Patra and her husband Gordon about St. Paul de Métis. Nathalie does a very great presentation on the history of the St. Paul de Métis. And so she tells a story of what she remembers as a child and what they did to her father. Delia Gray was so dear to everybody's hearts. She was the Métis Nation of Alberta's provincial elder. And for many years, the building that we own on Kingsway Avenue is named after her. And so she has passed for many years now. But what we did was we approached her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren to tell the story of how Delia's life affected them. And later on, I'm going to read an excerpt of her story. Diane Ludwig, part of the 60s Scoop, an awesome elder in Lac La Biche. She's in the schools and does wisdom teachings and everything with the children. Doreen Burgum, she's the region elder for Region 3. And she knew she was Métis. She grew up with her culture, but she lived in a town that would not allow her to share it. So they would go home and close the drapes and practice in jig. But when they went out into the town they lived in, they were not Métis. And so that's a story of having to be the forgotten or hidden in plain sight. Doreen Patra, President Patra's sister-in-law, grew up, tells a very good story about, we were happy, we had food, we didn't know we were poor, but according to everybody else living around us, we were poor. I grew up the exact same way. Gail Gillespie, she is the daughter of Bertha Clark Jones. Bertha Clark Jones was a decorated veteran. She was the Métis local president of Athabasca for many years. And one day she called me up and she says, Marilyn, I need a Métis cart. You're going to have to make it happen. And so if you're ever driving through Athabasca, there's a beautiful Métis cart sitting alongside the river. And that was me and Bertha Clark Jones made that happen. Juanita Marwa, she built and created Métis Crossing for us. So if any of you ever get a chance to go out to Métis Crossing, you will see how beautiful it is. And she tells the story of growing up Métis, but walking into the kitchen where Kookum and them were sitting around the table talking about it. And she comes in and they stop. And so she grew up not knowing her culture, not knowing where she came from, because at some point in time, it wasn't cool to be Indigenous. Lisa Wolf, she was a Edmonton City Police for a long, long time. And she speaks about the racism and all the stuff that she had to endure while being on the force. Sky Blue Morin, talked about her earlier. We could not have done this book without her. She has translated everybody's story into Michif so that we can actually touch some of the hearts of our elders and our seniors who can still speak and read Michif. Language is very, very important to us, and we need to continue to ensure that it lasts forever. Norma Spicer, she is currently the Métis Nation of Alberta's knowledge keeper, and she tells us the story of the buffalo hunt. Pearl Callahayson, I'm sure she is very well known to all of you, very proud Métis woman, and was the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs for many, many years. And she was so excited and so happy to tell her story. And Muriel Stanley Venn is very, very, very dear to us. She has done so much for Indigenous women from the time she started. And her story is one of, if you ever get to go to the Royal Alberta Museum, her story is in there. And she was actually, her husband beat her and threw her in an alley and left her for dead. But she didn't die. She rose up and she became the world's greatest advocate for Indigenous women. And she created the organization of Advancement of Aboriginal Women. And now her daughter has taken up the reins and has gone with that. So so Bill, do you want me to read the story now?
Yeah, I think we have time to read maybe one, maybe two stories and then just finish it off.
Okay. So I've chosen a story from Delia Gray, and because it's very, very touching, and it's about not being judgmental or anything like that. So this one is actually written by Crystal Letty, so the beautiful artwork. And so Crystal Letty is Delia Gray's grandchild. This is the one I tell when trying to describe my Kookum. This was in the summer of early fall of 1997. Kookum lived downtown and would call me up to take her places for meetings. She liked calling it going to a do or to go shopping. My first child was born early in the spring, and Kookum would find some really good reasons that would have me bringing the baby over. On that particular day, it was a really nice day, so we ended up going shopping in the city center mall, right in the heart of downtown Edmonton. I was pushing the stroller with the baby in it, and Kookum was fussing over the baby, very proud of being out and about with her great-granddaughter, speaking to the baby in Cree and adding and giving me advice. Up ahead, there was a man sitting on the sidewalk, leaning against a building, asking for change. He looked rough, and most people were just walking by him. She elbowed me. She was quite a bit shorter than me, so it was a little jab to the hip, and told me to just keep walking. Don't look at the man. Don't talk to him. Just keep walking, so that the baby wouldn't be bothered, she said. I told her I would do as she said as we got closer. She moved so that she would be between the stroller and the man standing on the sidewalk. As we were about to pass, he looked up at us and began to ask for some change. Kookum looked at him and suddenly stopped. I stopped, thinking something was wrong, but realized She had stopped right in front of the man. She told me to ignore. She took a step towards him and asked if a certain person was his auntie. He looked startled. His glazed over look suddenly became a sharp and said yes. She then asked if another woman was his mother. He said yes and stood up. She started to tell him a story about his mom, then a great story about his grandfather. The man was so happy to listen, and I remember his grin just lighting up his face. They chatted for a bit, and then Kookum took out her wallet and started to pull out a $10 bill. If you know her, it was a big deal, and she was very frugal. He said he didn't want to take her money and they talked back and forth for a bit. As the conversation began to become difficult for him, she made him promise to call his mother. He promised he would, and she introduced the baby as her great-granddaughter, and I was her granddaughter. He was so kind, saying hello to the baby and then to me. Kookum then urged me on, helping to push the stroller down the sidewalk. I tried asking her about this, but she just returned to fussing over the baby. This wasn't the only time this sort of interaction would happen. She would see people and ask a few questions and figure out who were their relations and tell them a great story connecting them to a community and a place. She would give them pride in who they were and where they came from. So I picked this because it's a very powerful example of storytelling and how it brought the individual back to his family, back to his community, and hopefully he called his mom. And so that was by Crystal Letty. Bailey, did you want to read one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have time. I'll read one and then I'll just finish it off. So thank you so much, Marilyn. I love that story. It's one of my favorites from the book. I'm going to read just, it's how the book ends, actually. It's a story from Diane Ludwig. So we ended the book with a section called Resiliency and Celebration because, you know, I wanted the book to be as much about fighting adversity and persevering as I could. But of course, there are, you know, moments of hardship and struggle and, you know, pain. And I wanted to end it on a really positive note. And I think Diane's story really encapsulates a lot of what I wanted to showcase in this book and what I think a lot of the women in the book, you know, it comes out in their stories. So Diane says, I went back to school and I got my social work degree. I went to work for social services in Lac La Biche. I lasted 8 months and I just about had a nervous breakdown. I've never in my life seen kids so beaten up, so neglected as I did when I worked for social services. I couldn't take it, so I had to leave. After I left social services, I went to work as a parole officer, and I liked part of it. And then I worked for Métis Child and Family Services Native Counseling. Just about every one of my jobs had to do with working with people because I love working with them, all of them. Then, of course, I came to Portage College. It was Native Cultural Arts, and I thought, boy, that's the one for me. So I went back to school again and I took that course because I knew how to do all the stuff they were presenting in the courses that they had, but you know how it is. You always need that white piece of paper saying, you can do this. So that's why I went back to school. I became an instructor in the Native Cultural Arts program, and that's how I got into school. I got into the school teaching Cree and then teaching the arts, so I could do both things, and that was a plus for me. From what I learned as a young person, and I've put that to good use. I taught girls how to make moss bags, and with that, there's a lesson, right? With everything that I taught these kids, I taught them the lesson behind what I was delivering. That made it a lot better. Now I can walk down the street, and these kids never forget you. You treat them good, and you respect them, and they never forget you. Never, ever. I truly believe everybody comes into this world has a gift, and my gift is to work with the youth, and I try to pass that knowledge on to them. I try to pass that knowledge on to them, and I tell them how important it is for them to learn that and never forget who they are and be proud of who they are. Don't ever be ashamed of who you are. Walk it proud. Walk it proud of who you are, and don't ever be ashamed that you're Métis or First Nations or whatever, because there's so much to learn out there. There's so much to learn about your culture. It's been a good life, and I can't ever say that it wasn't. I have a lot of things that I've taught my children, and I'm not sorry that I was given 6 children to raise. It's beautiful, 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 and I would do it all over again. So that's Diane Ludwig's story. I just love how she talks about her passion for the youth and for teaching kids. And yeah, I really thought that was an amazing story to end it on. So now just to wrap up the presentation, I wanted to just say this. We each have a story to tell. How can you tell yours? And I think I just want to really make it known that you do not have to get a publishing deal to tell your story. You do not have to, make a movie to tell your story. And I think it's really, really valuable that we can all write down and share our story and our family's story. Like Marilyn said, my mom, she built a website. There's free website builders online. She built a website. She went out and she got the stories from my grandpa, my great aunts, and my great uncles, and just sat them down at a table and had them talk about their experiences and their history and what they remember growing up. And my grandpa passed away last year. And now if I ever want to hear those stories from him, I can. And that's not something I think a lot of people can say. If I ever want to go and listen to my grandpa tell the story of growing up, I can do that. So if you have the abilities, you can go make a website. If you don't, write it down, put it in a notebook, record it on your phone. Most people have a phone nowadays. Put it in there. Ask your grandparents, your Kookums, your aunties, uncles to just write down their stories and record them in whatever way feels most comfortable to you. I think it's, storytelling is so universal, and as much as we can, we should be recording these stories and saving them for future generations, because how valuable is it to be able to hear the stories of your great grandparents? So yeah, that's the end of our presentation. Thank you everyone for being here and for listening. We really appreciate it. And thanks to, RCMR for setting this all up. I've, been to many of these Métis Talks in the past, and it's really, really cool to be able to be on the other side of one of these. So thank you so much. And I'll stop sharing now.
And I just wanted to add also, thank you very much. And for those of you who have supported us and who have gone out and bought the book, thank you so much, because all of the proceeds from this book go into a New Dawn Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Fund, where we can help the families or victims or any way we can. So we're not profiting off this book. We've created the fund already, and actually for a nonfiction book, we have surpassed the amount of sales of any book. So thank you so much for your support. Oh, sorry about that. Thank you so much for your support and your continued support. And yes, I'm hoping one day there'll be a volume 2. Thank you, Nathalie and Rupert Sand Center for Research for hosting us today. And it was a great pleasure to be here. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Marilyn and Bailey, for this wonderful presentation. So I think I'll turn to Amanda for questions. And so we have around 15 minutes for questions.
Sure. Great. Thank you, Bailey and Marilyn, for that wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed the book. The stories are so, inspirational. Yeah. There's a bit of 20-second delay for the broadcast here. So we're just waiting for questions to roll in, but I would like to start with a question. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the New Dawn Women's Society, what you guys do. Do you guys have regular meetings? And yeah.
So of course, during COVID, we haven't had a lot of chances to meet, but we do have a board that I'm elected provincially, and so is Bailey. And then we do have regional representatives in all of the 6 regions within the Métis Nation of Alberta. Like I said, I want to create this not as a political group, but as a support group for women in the regions. There is a place for politics, and and I consider that to be my job. And sometimes I have to drag Bailey along with me, but it's not that political. It can get political, but it's not. So, but thanks to President Audrey Putra, I'm allowed to be the president as well. So because we're a small organization, all of our funding runs through the Métis Nation. We do get some funding from the federal government. And so during COVID, we've done wellness packages where we send out to women like beading kits and, just stuff like that for wellness. We do have a partnership with the Métis Nation of Alberta. Once COVID is completed as well, is to create another another fund to help women who are in sexually abused court cases or rape cases where I know the justice system is just horrible and that needs to be changed. So we support them as much as we can. We are supporting a young lady in Fort McKay on one of the cases. So we do that as well. And we try to have regular meetings, but on Zoom and a limited amount of funds that we do have. We do have a great big huge gathering every year, and we had a splendid one planned for March 2020 where I was going to bring in self-defense, an author from I Never Lied, Shelley Wainga. Sorry, I'm just slaughtering people's last names here, but yeah. And so it's her story of sexual abuse, and yeah, and we had makeovers planned and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, we're here to be a support for anything, any small thing that women might need. You can call us and we'll try to support them as much as we can.
Yep.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to say, because we do have our board, we have a regional representative in every region, and they're each doing something different. They each have their own programs, they each have their own connections that they're making. Regionally, I don't have all of that information off the top of my head, like what they're doing, but I know a lot of the regions have some really great stuff going. So if you're in one of the regions and you want to connect with your regional representative for New Dawn, you can just reach out to us on Facebook and we can get you we can connect you with that person if anyone's interested in getting involved in their own region. So
wonderful. Thank you. So throughout the presentations, we've had about 50 people stop in. We're sitting at 48 right now, and the questions are now starting to roll in. The first one is from Kim Elliott, who says, oh, thank you or it's actually just a note of gratitude. Thank you very much, Bailey and Marilyn from grade 8 class at Prairie River in High Prairie.
Oh, that's my niece. She's a teacher. That's awesome. Thanks, Cam.
Right. And then another from, I believe, Leah. Another question from me. How did you choose the participants for the first book? And do you already have women who want to participate in the next book?
Yeah, this was really interesting. We've been asked this a lot, and this book was truly kind of a product of COVID. We started, I think, in March 2020, so right at the beginning. I think if it hadn't been for the pandemic, we would have gone about our choices much differently. Not in that we would have chose different people necessarily, just that we would have gone into community and been able to talk to people during events or programs, and gotten maybe to talk to a lot wider of a range of people. But because of COVID, we really had to, we realized we couldn't do that. We couldn't go into community. So we sat down and we just talked through, the people that we knew, the people that we had connections with, we had relationships with, people we thought might have a really interesting and broad diversity of experiences and opinions. And we also wanted to pick people from across the province. We didn't want to just, focus, only get people from Edmonton. We wanted there to be a wide range of experiences, and that includes like geographically. So we have people that are, far up north, far south, from every single region. And that's kind of what we started going through, and we're just like, oh, that person, I think, I know them, I know their story. I think that would be really valuable. And we knew we couldn't, tell everyone's story. And we knew that there would be, people who'd be like, hey, I have a good story. And like everyone does, but we just really had to narrow it down to the people that, maybe we already had those pre-existing connections with. And that was really mostly due to COVID, because we would have loved to gone out and meet new people and hear a variety of different experiences, but we weren't able to do that. So that's kind of how that happened. And it just kind of came together organically. We just started reaching out to people, and pretty much everybody was on board and very happy to share. And it was a little difficult trying to, some people don't necessarily have the same ability to access things like Zoom and tell their story over virtual means. So it was a little bit of trial and error, but we figured it out, and we were able to get those. So
yeah, we actually sat down, and I think our original list was about 23 or 24 women. And basically we knew that we had the categories like the resiliency and the 60 scoop and the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so we just went out and we looked for champions in those that were already telling their stories and and going out and doing presentations, so that their stories were healing. And so those were the types of people that we reached out to as well. And and they said yes. There was some controversy at the beginning of how dare you write a book without my mom in it and that kind of stuff. So we do address that in the forward and the afterward type thing. So, and then, we do want to do a volume 2. If there's enough interest, we do want to do a volume 2, or we could go province, regional, community, whatever. We're here to support that if that's the wish of the ladies. So, but we started out with about 24, and then we moved it down to 14.
Wonderful. Any other questions? Nathalie, do you have any questions?
I do, related to the movie, because or the documentary. I mentioned when we were talking offline that I showed the documentary to my class on Monday, and people loved it. So when did you make the movie? Because you talked about the book and the limitations that COVID put around, creating the book. But what about the documentary?
Yeah, that kind of came, I think Marilyn kind of talked about the beginning about how it was actually a lawyer who said this would be really cool to have these videos. And we're like, oh gosh, that would be. So, we talked with our publisher, and is this something we can do? So if you do have a copy of the book, I have my blur filter on, but on the first page here, there is this, again, it's blurry, but there's a QR code right in here. You can scan it, you can watch the documentary, it's on Vimeo. And that was hard too because of COVID, actually. We hired a Métis filmmaker who is based out of Ontario. His name is Matt LeMay. We've worked with him in the past. CMNA's worked with him in the past. He's super awesome, super friendly. I love working with Matt. We connected with him. We told him our idea for the documentary. He was on board 100%. He loved the idea, was really excited about it. And we then had to figure out how we could essentially get a documentary put together without him being able to come out to Alberta and film and record the women himself, because that's usually what he does. So, we were compiling clips that I had taken on my tablet on my grandma's, kitchen table of my Auntie Oreen. We had a few of the women, luckily, were able to come into the Métis Nation of Alberta office, and one of our videographers at the office was able to record. But we weren't able to be there, which was kind of one of the hard things too, is that, it was a lot of trust put into each other, and luckily it worked out really well. Some of the women I got onto Zoom and I just recorded our conversation and I sent all those clips to Matt, and really he's like a miracle worker, because he was able to kind of take all of these hours of footage. We even had some that were just recordings that my mom had taken years ago, where you can hear people talking in the background and they're telling their story just on a phone. And Matt was able to do magic and put it all together into a cohesive story that I think really is a great addition to the book. So I can't take too much credit for that. Matt really, I got some of the videos, but I just sent them to him and I was like, I trust you. And luckily he was really great and he did such a great job. So yeah, if anyone wants to watch it, I think it's about 20 minutes, and you can get a link to it if you have a copy of the book right at the front there. So yeah,
perfect for the classroom too.
Yeah, that was one of the hopes.
Get discussions going, so in that sense, I think it's a great addition to the book.
Yeah,
so
we'd heard a lot that
20 more volumes,
Yeah,
the documentary for everyone. Yeah, we were hoping
nice.
There's not always a ton of Métis videos or content out there, and we're always getting teachers, in me and my job as a youth manager, we always have people being like, do you have anything we can use for, we're doing our Métis module, and, Rupert's Land is obviously doing some amazing stuff, and finally we're getting more and more content out, but there's been such a lack of that for so long that hopefully this can just be one little piece to help teachers and educators.
And I think we came in the market right at the right time, where the people were starving, for a lack of a better word, for materials and resources on the Métis, right? And I think when the book was released, it was at a pivotal moment, and I think that's why it just spread like wildfire. all over
Yeah.
the place. So, which is we're very grateful for a nonfiction book. So,
Yeah.
Yes, I totally agree that this book has been perfect timing.
Yeah, I think I wrote in the book, I went on, of course, the tragedy was discovered of the 215 kids found in Kamloops. I was writing I believe it was the introduction, and I, couldn't help but put that in there. And then I had someone ask me, I forget who, but did you write it because of that? And I'm like, no, I'm not that fast, but it definitely kind of came during that time when everyone, I think unfortunately that it took so long, but people's eyes were really being opened, and you could kind of feel change in the air. And I mentioned it in the introduction that, like, it's kind of time for things to happen and things to change. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
True reconciliation is action and not words. So every word spoken about reconciliation, there's an action that needs to come after that. So I think we're finally moving into that with the delegation going to Rome, with the Métis content, and then with the Pope coming back over here. So I think we're slowly moving in the right direction, and I truly believe that one day we'll find true reconciliation.
Yes. Yeah. Very exciting times.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I think that puts us at time. So Nathalie, if I can hand it off to you and you can introduce our next presentation.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Bailey and Marilyn. So our next presentation is from Dr. Cheryl Troupe. Cheryl is a Métis scholar originally from North Central Saskatchewan and a member of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan, Gabrielle Dumont Local Number 11. She's an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Saskatchewan, where she received her PhD in 2019. Her research centers on Métis Road Allowance Communities in Western Canada, merging Indigenous research methodologies, oral histories, and family genealogies with historical geographic information systems to focus on the intersections, land, gender, kinship, and how stories are connected to specific places. Her current SHRC-funded research focuses on utilizing Métis voices and perspectives to examine their experiences with dislocation and dispossession from the road allowance, recasting these communities not as marginal or liminal places, but as spaces where families, Michif language, and Métis cultural practices remained strong. Much of her work also focuses on the multifaceted roles of Métis women in their families and communities, and the importance of female kinship relationships in structuring these communities. She has worked within her community for over 20 years in the areas of historical and community-based research, curriculum development, community engagement, advocacy, and health policy and program planning. So Cheryl will, the title of her presentation is Restoring Métis Road Allowance Communities. Your turn, Cheryl. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathalie. I'll just share my screen. Great. So thank you, Nathalie, and the Rupertsland Center and organizers for inviting me to participate today. So as Nathalie mentioned, my name is Cheryl Troupe. I'm Métis with Red River roots. My family comes from the Prince Albert region in North Central Saskatchewan. Some of my relatives come from around the Fort LaCorne or the Saskatchewan River Forks area, where the river splits into the North and South Saskatchewan rivers. Others come from the Lily Plain region west of Prince Albert. But I myself grew up in an urban center, but I've been connected to the land in various cultural ways throughout my life. So I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis, specifically the homeland of the Round Prairie Métis community, some of whom I'm going to be speaking about today. Round Prairie was not a road allowance community, but was a settlement occupied by Métis buffalo hunters from the 1850s onward, give or take about 20 years following 1885. These families owned the land they lived on as homestead land, but lost it for various reasons, and then moved into the city of Saskatoon. And it's in Saskatoon where many, but not all of the families then formed a road allowance community at the south end of the city, in an area of the urban space that was not yet developed. And this was one of the common places where road allowance communities were created in the 20th century. So into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, agricultural settlement and Canadian government policy steadily displaced Prairie Métis within their traditional territory. Métis families increasingly faced pernicious anti-Métis racial discrimination and the imposition of Euro-Canadian values from a growing settler society in response to Métis actions during the 1885 Northwest Resistance. Many Métis had few options but to relocate their families and reestablish themselves on land they didn't own, forming communities on newly surveyed, unoccupied Crown lands reserved for roads, next to First Nations reserves, or on the correction lines, which were adjustments to the Dominion Land Survey to compensate for the convergence of lines of longitude. These peripheral spaces have become known as road allowance communities. While existing scholarship has largely depicted road allowance communities as marginal, liminal, or temporary spaces, a review of oral history reveals a different narrative. My talk today focuses on Métis stories, particularly gendered stories, to challenge how we understand and define road allowance communities, recasting them not as marginal or liminal places, but as spaces of cultural strength, resilience, and resistance, where despite the impact of settler colonialism, kinship systems, Michif language, and cultural practices remain strong. I would like to acknowledge that the stories I'm sharing today are stories I have gathered through my own research work and through the relationships I've created with Métis community members across Saskatchewan over almost 2 decades. These are stories that I've been given permission to share, and this is research that many people have contributed to, including some that are no longer with us. I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of Margaret Harrison, Bob Desjardins, George Klein, Maria Campbell, Nora Cummings, Roy Putra, Norma Welsh, Joe Welsh, Pauline Anderson, Dorothy Fayant, and many others who I am eternally grateful to for the time and the stories they have each shared with me. So about stories. In the work that I've done, I've gathered many different types of stories. So there are family stories, including those that share genealogy and outline kinship relationships and obligations to one another. There are stories of land use, food harvesting, preservation and production. And there are women's stories that speak to the work and responsibilities of women as mothers, grandmothers, aunties, and sisters. There are stories of economic transition, adaptation, loss, displacement, physical upheaval, government intervention and oppression. And there are stories that share important events and celebrations, as well as stories about community tension and division. There are stories full of high-spirited energy, humor, songs, and the Michif language that demonstrate strength and cultural continuity. And there are also those that are difficult to tell, including stories about alcohol in the community, family breakdown, racism, marginalization, and poverty. What is central in all of these stories is the way that they connect us to the places and to the people who tell them. Stories define people's relationships to the land and explain their presence on it. Oral history and stories about place are grounded in the local landscape and play a central role in the construction of Indigenous histories and understandings. Dakota scholar Angela Cavender Wilson contends that stories provide a sense of identity and belonging for community members and situates them within their lineage, establishing their relationship to the rest of the natural world. According to anthropologist Keith Basso in his work with the Western Apache, quote, "Whenever community members speak about their landscapes, whenever they name it and tell stories about it, they represent it in ways that are compatible with shared understandings of how they know themselves to occupy it. So for those that grew up in mid-20th century road allowance communities, themes of family, community, and the landscape permeate their stories. Place is central in how these individuals share their stories, how they understand themselves, their history, and their experiences. So in order to better understand and define road allowance communities, it is essential to examine Métis stories about these places. This photograph is taken on the south side of the Kookum Valley in southern Saskatchewan, and it looks north at the very end of the lake. This is Kookum Lake, where there was a road allowance that I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes. So movement to the road allowance began in earnest after 1885 and continued well into the 20th century. These communities were unique to the provinces of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta, and by the 1940s numbered in the hundreds. This is a map of several road allowance communities in southern and central Saskatchewan, but is by no means a depiction of all road allowance communities in the province during this period. So while oral histories and published personal reminiscences demonstrate that Métis faced racism in their everyday interactions with settlers and with government, they also demonstrate that in these communities, families continued to organize themselves along extended family kinship networks, living in close proximity to one another for mutual aid and support, but also to maintain social and cultural practices of visiting, storytelling, celebrating, and sharing of food. So much of my work is around connecting stories to specific places. And so I use a lot of mapping technology in my work. So it's called historical geographic information systems, which is a methodology for collecting geographically referenced data and then representing it spatially on maps. And so this is a map of the Kookum Road Allowance community in the Kookum Valley, and the green on this map represents the valley hillsides. And this is a map of the extended Reset and Pelche family, and they recognize themselves all as one community. So these are families that lived in the Kookum Valley from the 1850s onward, and they faced displacement by settlers in the 1870s and 80s. And then the provision of land and money scrip in 1885 failed to secure their tenure to the plots of land that they occupied. These families were then forced to relocate themselves to the road allowance, taking up land at the end of Kookum Lake, like you see here, along the shores where it was considered unoccupied Crown land, and then on land set aside for roads further down the valley. Some of those, like Norbert and Louis Reset, which are right in the very center of this map. I don't know if you can see that right here. They were patriarchs of the Reset family, and they lived on land that was owned by a local settler. His name is Ernest Skinner, and they lived on at the edges of his land because they, Norbert and Louis, and then some of their extended family, they all worked for the Skinners as seasonal labor, and so they were able to live on that land. But again, it was land that they didn't own. So when faced with displacement, these families made choices about where to live so that they could remain on land and continue to harvest essential environmental resources. And they made choices about how to spatially organize themselves within recognizable extended family groupings that privilege relationships between individuals. So most, but not all road allowance communities of this period were organized this way along extended family lines. But many also organized around female kinship. This was a spatial organization pattern carried over from the buffalo hunting brigades of a century prior, as having kinship relationships was essential, but female kinship relationships were perhaps even more important when you consider the cultural and economic stability that women provided through gathering, growing, preserving, and preparing food to sustain their families, as well as the important role that women played in maintaining familial relationships and cultural practices during this period of very immense change. So on the road allowance, Families relied on a subsistence lifestyle of fishing, trapping, gathering of wild foods, supplemented by small-scale agriculture or growing gardens, as well as digging Seneca root and then taking part in wage labor when available. Men were a cheap source of seasonal or day labor for local farmers, such as the Roussettes that I talked about just briefly. And they worked to clear fields, pick rocks, or potatoes. Most often, families worked as an economic unit, with women helping in the fields, as well as maintaining the more domestic responsibilities of caring for the children and the old people. So women's labor was crucial in harvesting, preparing, and preserving food and medicines to support their families. For some families, digging Seneca root was also a family affair and was such an important source of income that one elder recalled that it was through the sale of Seneca root that they were able to build their home. Academic treatment of this experience, however, has framed the Métis in terms of their poverty, their health, and their social problems, where they have been seen as a drain on municipal and provincial welfare coffers and at odds with settlers, with the development of settler society. Historian Laurie Barron argues that by the time Saskatchewan was created as a province in 1905, Métis communities generally were being engulfed by an unsympathetic settler society whose ability to monopolize social and economic power cast disdain upon Métis values and their way of life. It was a life of almost total destitution and poverty, and apart from the social and racial condemnation it sometimes aroused, it met with little public sympathy and government inaction. The disdain that settler society and government had for the Métis is clearly and overwhelmingly reflected in the archival record. The Métis are depicted in highly prejudicial ways, according to every racial stereotype possible, and in need of rehabilitation. So much so that the Métis become the focus of Saskatchewan Premier Tommy Douglas's newly created Provincial Department of Social Welfare and Rehabilitation after his election in the mid-1940s. Unsure of how to deal with what the provincial government determined as the Métis problem, the department set out to survey the economic, health, and social conditions of Métis Road Allowance communities. Enumerating over 2,000 Métis across the province, these surveys paint a picture of poor health, little economic or educational opportunity, punctuated by racism, prejudice, and misunderstanding of Métis ways of life. The survey taken in the Big River Debden area demonstrates this misinterpretation. According to the government agent, the Métis he witnessed, quote, all have a team of ponies so they can move around the country to picnics, etc. But you will not find a cow, chickens, or garden. That is work and keeps them at home. During the summer months, they are always on the move and attend every picnic in the neighborhood, end quote. Yet a review of oral history and stories from Métis elders about this period suggests that these were not in fact picnics, but more likely the expression of Métis seasonal economic practices where entire families moved to pick berries and harvest seasonal foods. Métis author and storyteller Maria Campbell describes berry picking excursions where the entire community or the entire extended family would pack up their wagons and move together in ways similar to the old buffalo hunts of the 19th century, and families would live in tents, camping close to where berries could be harvested and plants such as Seneca root could be dug. While in these camps, women often work together to care for children and continue their domestic labor of cleaning, laundry, and feeding their families. Similarly, Margaret Harrison suggests that these picnics may also have been an example where Métis families moved closer to where work could be found, relocating the entire family to camp near a farmer's field so that the men, and often the women, could work on a seasonal basis, clearing fields, picking rocks, and harvesting crops. While in these camps, Margaret recalled that as the oldest child, she, along with her grandmother, were responsible for preparing meals in the camp, feeding the children and old people, and keeping the children busy while her mother provided her domestic labor in settler households or worked in the fields alongside Margaret's father. Consequently, to an outsider, such as this particular government agent, These picnics may have seemed like an entertaining and recreational afternoon excursion, but in reality were more likely the continuation of Métis economic practices where families took advantage of seasonal cycles and harvested what they needed to feed themselves and their families throughout the winter, or an example of the way in which they maintained cultural practices while adapting to the new economic order in settler society. Living together in extended family groupings not only allowed the Métis to follow recognizable economic patterns, but also sustain culturally grounded social processes. In these communities, Métis families maintain kinship relationships and the obligations and responsibilities that these relationships entailed. These communities functioned as spaces where cultural values and practices were upheld, intergenerational knowledge transfer happened, and traditional and cultural knowledge continued to be passed on. The maintenance of kinship relationships ensured that old people were taken care of. And I use this term at the request of those in the community who refer to their elders in this way. Old people in the community often maintained their independence, but lived in close proximity to relatives for support. Nora Cummings recalled that her Kookum, or grandmother Justine Troupe, lived in her own small shack next to her family, and that she was very independent. It was Nora's role and that of her brother and sister to help their Kookum by hauling water, chopping wood, and helping with domestic chores. Often, old people were provided with meat and fish by family members, but they also grew their own gardens and continued to hunt, fish, and trap well into old age. This is the first image is an image of Nora and her siblings. And then the middle image is the home that they lived in on the Road Allowance in Saskatoon, and the summer tent that they lived in. And then the last image is an image of Kookum Justine. As Nora mentioned, one of her responsibilities was to take care of some of her grandmother's chores, such as chopping wood. And once this was done, her Kookum always made sure to pick up all of the small chips of wood, which you can see her doing here, because she wanted to make sure that the wood was not wasted because she was going to burn it for kindling. And so this was one of the ways that she worked together with her grandmother to make sure that her grandmother could remain independent. So old people like Nora's Kookum Justine were respected for their age, wisdom, and experience, including those with specialized knowledge such as midwives and healers, and old women who were seen as matriarchs in the community. Old people were the custodians and transmitters of traditions and religious beliefs, and responsible for sharing cultural and practical knowledge with younger generations. Matriarchs held an esteemed position within families and were often those that were sought out for advice and played a significant role in family governance, working to ensure the maintenance of harmonious relationships across the large extended family. Regularly, it was these matriarchs or older aunties in the community that watched and listened, sharing information with each other to ensure that family members upheld community values and family reputations. It was also older women such as Mathilde Karen, that's pictured here, that ensured religious services were observed by members of the extended family, as well as that the community's children were baptized. Frequently, it was also these women who kept track of family births, deaths, and marriages. Maintaining knowledge that identified who one was related to was an important function in Métis communities that privileged kinship relationships. In these large extended families, it was important to know where your kinship relationships extended, particularly when selecting marriage partners. Although, as old people suggest, there often remained a degree of marriage arrangement in these communities. Consequently, older women remained respected and vital members of their family networks. Cultural continuity in Road Allowance communities was supported by individuals with specialized knowledge, such as midwives, healers, and those that know funerary practices and protocols. Although a lot of people knew some basic medicines and treatments, and a lot of women helped with birthing and initial childcare, there were those that held significant and specialized knowledge and expertise. These were important people in the community, held in high regard, and were often recognized for their skills across communities. Margaret Harrison recalled that her Kookum, Vitaline Pelche, in this first picture, she was the midwife in the Katepo area, and that she went whenever a baby needed to be delivered. Her Kookum was also the one that Margaret's mother went to when anyone in the family was sick. While Margaret's mother knew many basic remedies, it was always special when her grandmother came to take care of Margaret and her siblings. I'm not sure what happened.
Hey, Cheryl. Yeah, it looks like your presentation, just your slides came down. If you can just put those back up.
Technical glitches.
Yeah,
Okay, sorry about that.
not at all.
Okay, we'll carry on. So likewise, Bob Desjardins shares stories of his Kookum Meros being a respected medicine woman and midwife in the community, and how she used to visit all the homes on the road allowance, checking to see if any of the children might be sick. As someone with specialized knowledge, it was her responsibility to share it across the community, and his family in turn shared food with her in exchange for her services. This is an image of Margaret's grandmother, Vitaline Pelche, and then the other image is Flora Allery Reset, who is one of Bob Desjardins' Kookums, but she is sister-in-law to this Kookum Meros that Bob talks about as the midwife. Flora Allery was also one of those in the community that was respected for her knowledge around birthing and childcare. So just as it was their responsibility to share their skills, it was often the role of old people to pass on their knowledge to children in the family, ensuring the intergenerational transfer of cultural knowledge. This teaching was often experiential, where children learned important cultural lessons by helping their grandparents in everyday activities, such as picking medicines or harvesting wild foods. Maria Campbell shares stories of the responsibility of old women in being the first to teach children about the protocols of hunting and trapping, including those about making offerings, demonstrating thankfulness to the Creator, and honoring the spirit of the life taken. While Joe Welsh, a recognized Métis storyteller, recalled the importance of berry picking and berry patches as activities and spaces that created opportunity for the transmission of cultural knowledge and sharing of valuable information. He remembered learning about the importance of traditional food harvesting protocols from his Aunt Margaret, who always made an offering when picking berries. According to Welsh, it was also in the berry patch where girls learned valuable lessons about womanhood and their roles in the family and community. This was such an important teaching and learning space that he referred to the berry patch as a space where their culture was held and where the school was. It was through the maintenance of these types of activities, made possible by living in the extended family road allowance community, that land-based knowledge, stories, and lessons of Métis worldview were passed on. The social organization of road allowance communities also allowed for the maintenance of social and cultural traditions around sharing food and making sure that all members of the family had enough to eat. Sharing of food was a way to bring people together, making it an integral part of all Métis gatherings and celebrations. Families looked after one another and shared food and resources with family members who had less. The sharing of food was a critical means of acknowledging and maintaining kinship relationships and responsibilities. The social aspect of sharing your home, food, and making guests feel welcome was very important. Even when visiting others in their homes, Margaret Harrison recalled that you always took food along to help out the family. For Métis families, visiting, dancing, music, and feasting were inseparable and remained possible within road allowance communities. They frequently held dances in people's homes with the furniture pushed aside or moved out, making room for dancing. Local fiddle players played long into the night as Métis families danced the Red River Jig, the Reel of Four, the Duck Dance, and other traditional dances. Roy Putcher recalled that dances, pie socials, and card playing occurred frequently in their home, except during Lent. And when company came, his mother always cooked for visitors. Even if it was just a simple soup, tea, and bannock, it was the hospitable act of sharing food that was important. According to Roy, quote, "We were poor, but I thought we were rich because when company came, we always had lots of food," end quote. Sharing of food was a part of these social and cultural activities and helped renew and strengthen the bonds of family. The complexity of these visiting, sharing, and feasting traditions indicates that these communities were far more than a temporary or liminal space. In most Métis communities of the period, holiday celebrations centered on New Year's rather than Christmas. This was a tradition carried over from the buffalo hunting winter camps of the mid to late 19th century. The celebrating started early on New Year's Day, beginning by first visiting the home of the family's oldest members. The celebration began with a blessing from the family patriarch before sharing a meal and then moving on to the next home. Movement throughout the community continued, and the evening ended in dancing, fiddle playing, singing, card playing, and storytelling. This celebrating regularly continued for 6 or 7 days, from New Year's Day until Epiphany or All Kings Day on January 6th. Agnes Pelche described these celebrations as she remembered them from the 1940s. According to Pelche, these were social times with always a lot of food to share, despite being poor. Quote, "We sure had a lot of fun when New Year's came around," she said. "We used to eat, have a little bit to drink. We always had a lot of fun on New Year's. We went around visiting, and this is how we celebrated for 7 days, from January 1st to 7th. These types of celebrations were also written about in the Regina Leader Post in 1948 and again in 1955 by Métis J.Z. Larocque. According to Larocque, New Year's was an annual custom celebrated by Métis families for almost 200 years. The 1948 New Year's celebration was a large community gathering celebrated across extended families. The function Larocque described was simple, but also an enthusiastic one, for most of the old-time dwellers were able to attend and enjoy their native foods. The celebration was presided over by elderly matriarch of the community, Elise Klein Kavanaugh, age 102, and St. Pierre Blondeau, who sat at the head table to receive visitors and recounted stories of hunting buffalo on the plains. They began with a moment of silence and prayer for 3 elderly members of the community that had passed away over the last year, followed by several short speeches before the fiddle playing and dancing began. The evening closed with a benediction or blessing from the community patriarchs. For Métis families, sharing of food was integral in how they understood and reinforced kinship relationships. Visiting solidified the act of food sharing and was an important part of all social activities. Visiting was not just for having fun, dancing, playing cards, and gossiping, but was important in maintaining relationships, working out family and community differences, and checking in on one another. It was through these social activities that families honored their old people, recounted their history, and expressed a worldview in which the sharing of food amongst kin was foundational. At New Year's in particular, these celebrations ensured that all families would have enough to eat and could take part in family and community festivities, even if their own pantries were bare. The depth of Métis traditional practices, cultural continuity, and reproduction in these road allowance communities indicates that these spaces were far more than temporary or liminal. When moving to the road allowance, families made decisions about how to maintain extended family networks and kinship relationships. Even if they did not own the land on which they lived, they remained intimately tied to their environment with sophisticated cultural and value systems that privileged the family, making these road allowance communities culturally rich spaces. Marcy.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. for your presentation on giving us a better idea of the daily lives in those communities. So we're going to turn to questions. Amanda, are there any questions coming in?
Not so far yet. Nathalie, do you have any questions off the top? I have my own, but I'm just kind of like rummaging around in my head to figure out how I want to phrase frame the question.
Cheryl, you could tell us a little bit more about the harvesting of Seneca roots and why people were doing that.
Sure. So, so Seneca root becomes this way for families to engage in a cash economy, and so Seneca root is dug, grows across southern Saskatchewan in a prairie environment, and families would go out together, often together, digging it with this kind of funny little stick to dig the root, and then they would dry it and then sell it to local merchants, and then it would be sent away. It was gathered for medicinal purposes, and so it was sent away and then to manufacturers. But it was a way for Métis families that they would bring actual cash into their economy or into their family, because most often they were working for farmers and in seasonal or day laboring positions where they were working for food in exchange for their labor. And so families often didn't have actual cash, but digging Seneca root was one of the ways in which they could bring cash into their homes. Another way that was often they brought cash into their homes was a lot of women did produced items of like material culture items. So in particular in the Qu'Appelle Valley, there was a lot of women that were making hooked rugs and selling them into settler homes or to settlers' families. And so that was another way that they were bringing income into the home, rather than just, trading their labor for food and supplies and things like that.
Does the digging of the Seneca root, so it must have been quite a big business in some ways, or was it just to add to what people were doing?
It was to add to what people were doing, because when people were digging Seneca root, they were also doing other kinds of harvesting. But Seneca root was different in that they were taking it and drying it, and then they were selling it at different merchants that were then, doing something else with it. And a lot of Métis families weren't necessarily using Seneca root for their own medicinal purposes, but it was being sent other places for that.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right, we have Paul Garrow joining us on the live chat. First, he says he loves the idea of a picnic, and yeah. And he also asks, are you doing any more work across the prairies and parklands? And he also loves the map of the Qu'Appelle Valley there.
Well, thank you. Okay, so so a lot of this work comes out of my dissertation research, which was focused on the Qu'Appelle Valley. But the current work that I'm working on right now is twofold. So I'm working with some folks here in Saskatoon to document that experience. The Road Allowance community here in south of the city of Saskatoon. But my other research project is focused more broadly on road allowance communities across the province, looking at, particularly I'm interested in looking at how communities were disbanded in the late 40s and 50s, looking at the policies of the Douglas government, the CCF government in creating Métis farms, and how communities were again pushed off their land out of road allowances as kind of this trajectory of continual movement and displacement of Métis families. So yes, across the prairies and across the parkland region.
There you go, Paul. Yes, the answer is yes. No others so far.
I have maybe another question, because so we know, for example, in some cases, there were some communities that were urban communities. And so I was just wondering, like, especially when we're looking at Saskatoon, for example, or even Regina, if you're doing also some work about some of these urban communities. And because here in Edmonton, there's a few places, and so, and people would continue to go back and forth between, you know, the outside of the boundaries of the city, and then they would come back depending on specific needs, depending at different times. And so are you seeing that also, that movement?
Yeah, and so in urban centers, we see road allowance communities kind of pop up. People are living at the margins of urban centers. In Saskatoon here, it's south of the city, and it's not until the 50s where they're pushed off the road allowance there, because the city expands to meet where they're already living. In Regina, there's families that move from the Qu'Appelle Valley into the city, and they end up, some of them are fine places to live, others end up in tents around the nuisance grounds, because this again was marginal land. In Prince Albert, it's, there was a road allowance community they called the Fox Farm that was right up, against the boundary of the city. So these are places that people were coming to because they were trying to engage with an urban economy, and they might have been pushed out of their own road allowance community and then have to form another community, which is what happens in Regina. So a lot of the people that end up in Regina are either coming out of the Qu'Appelle Valley road allowance communities and end up in this kind of very temporary space at the nuisance grounds, or they're coming from, they're part of a removal from the road allowance community at Lestock that's removed and sent to Green Lake, and then they try to go back to Lestock and there's no one left, there's no place left for them, and so they move into the city and they try to engage in the urban economy. So there's layers of this where there's road allowance communities that are established, people are pushed off of those road allowance communities into other road allowance communities that they create, or they, they're trying to find different ways to engage in in the settler economy, but they're continually being moved and displaced by the processes of settler colonialism.
Right. We have a question from Leah, who asks, are you finding there are any major differences between communities across the prairies and how they end up being in road allowances?
So there is some difference, and not all. So a lot of communities end up in road allowance communities because of challenges with the script system, and so they script fails to provide a land base for them. So when they get script, they would have to turn it into homestead land, or they would sell it. And so that's one way in which they're displaced of land. If they take it as homestead land, then a lot lost it for tax because they couldn't afford the taxes or couldn't afford the equipment that was necessary to, maintain a small scale agricultural homestead. And so they then lose their land because of those reasons and end up in road allowance communities. For instance, at Round Prairie, they owned their land outright as homestead, but a lot of them lost it because they couldn't afford the taxes. They move into the city. The community kind of separates. There's some that end up on the west side of the city, living in whatever homes they can find. There's others that end up on the east side that end up in the road allowance, right? And so they come to the city, and it's not about their script, it's about that they couldn't maintain their homestead. Others, like at the experience at Lestock, they end up in the road allowance because they're pushed out by settlement, by settlers coming in and taking up the land that they can't hold on to for various reasons. Some of it's script, some of it there's racism because they're not seen as what would qualify as a good farmer because they're trying to maintain a seasonal lifestyle. So they a lot of them lose their land that way. Decisions are made by homestead inspectors that they're not going to be good farmers. Therefore, their claims go into a process or their homestead lands go into a process where there's lots of challenges around it and they end up losing that way. So there's lots of different kinds of bureaucratic administrative ways that people are losing whatever occupancy, losing tenure to their lands in many ways, and then ending up on land that they don't own. In the Qu'Appelle Valley, another instance, when in 1885, when they were given the option of scrip, they collectively, there was about 115 that initially asked for land scrip. And then this was happening at the same time as the Battle of Batoche. And so they thought that the Métis were going to be victorious. And so they asked for, they changed their mind and asked for money scrip rather than land scrip. And so after the battle, then they ended up losing that, they ended up losing their scrip because they had wagered a bet that they were going to be victorious. And so a lot of the families end up taking homestead land at St. Delphine, which is north of the Qu'Appelle Valley, and then they can't maintain that because they ended up having to take it out as regular homesteaders, and then couldn't make the improvements, and end up down in the road allowance at Kateppo Lake and in other places in the Qu'Appelle Valley. So there's lots of different ways in which people end up on the road allowance, but really it's about the restrictions that are placed on them by the Dominion Lands Act and the homestead policy in the scrip system.
Shannon Kennedy asks, what road allowance communities still exist?
So people are not necessarily living in road allowance communities anymore, right? So they disbanded by the 1950s, but there are remnants of communities that still exist. So there are still some places where, there's still homes, shacks that are kind of falling down that are still you can still find, but the communities themselves don't exist. But that doesn't mean that those families that are connected to those places don't exist. So they still recognize themselves as communities. They just don't live in that specific place anymore. And that's a continuation of how Métis families have always organized themselves. So if we look back to, the ways in which they were hunting buffalo around family systems and brigades were coming together around extended families, that extended family system remains the way in which communities have always organized themselves, regardless of where they lived. And whether or not they lived on the road allowance or still live on the road allowance, they still organize themselves that way and still recognize themselves having a connection to those places.
And then another question, did settler communities interact with Métis communities, for example, in jigging gatherings?
Well, potentially. I don't know, they maybe would have been invited to some dances in their homes if they had relationships with them. But by and large, Métis families didn't engage with the settlers socially, but they would have engaged with them on an economic basis. So families would have been working for settlers. They might have, they might have had goods they were selling to settlers, that kind of thing. They engaged in that way. But socially, they, typically wouldn't have. There would have been maybe, examples where individuals might have, but by and large, they weren't, they didn't socialize together during this period because there was so much racism that was directed to Métis families, because they were seen as a problem by, this idea that Métis people were poor and they were destitute, they were on relief. And at the time, in the early 1900s into the 1930s, relief was provided by the municipalities. And so when you look at who is organizing in these municipalities and in positions of power, it's the local farmers, the local settlers. And so the municipalities can't afford to pay for relief or pay for the hospital care that Métis families might need, because they don't pay taxes because they don't pay land taxes because they're living on land they don't own. And so the responsibility falls to the municipalities. And so there's this huge rift between settlers and the Métis because of this. And so the municipalities see that they believe the Métis are taking advantage, and that, you know, they're draining our resources because we don't have enough, and we have to provide it all to relief efforts because, you know, because they're living in these communities that they're not sustaining themselves. So it's really a time where there's a lot of negative attitudes on behalf of settlers towards Métis people.
I was just going to add to this, like, because in some cases, like women, the healers, like they would provide, you know, like medicine to settlers. So was it an activity that continued through the 1930s and 40s and 50s, or do you feel that it was less, there was less of that connection? Because I know that at the end, well, throughout the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century and turn of the 20th century, the Métis women would provide quite a bit of help for medicine and also like to deliver babies and to settler communities. So I'm just curious to see if that continued on because of the racism that you're talking about.
I don't think that really continues on to any significant degree. So Métis women are still providing those services within their own communities, but I don't think they're providing them to settler communities into this period because there's starting to be doctors and, you know, access to medical care other places. So they're not, by, you know, in the early settlement period into the 1920s, by that time, really there's starting to be access to doctors where people women are going to have their babies. And so there's not as much, not as huge a role for Métis women to play that midwifery role. But that doesn't mean that it didn't happen in some communities, particularly those that might be very rural or very, you know, almost remote, where doctors couldn't come quick enough that they might rely on Indigenous women acting as midwives. So
would be interesting to find out more because of the fact that not everybody in the settler communities had access to a doctor. So.
Yeah, and in this period, we also start to see that some Métis communities are also starting to go to settler doctors, or, you know, because they're now accessible, right? And they're starting to go into hospitals, but they're still at the same time they're still relying on traditional medicines in their families and in their communities.
All right. Any final questions to those watching from YouTube? And it looks like there are no further questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. And so thank you to our presenters and also to the audience that took the time to come and listen to the wonderful presentations that we heard today. I'd like to also thank Amanda Evans for the work, the magic that she does on different levels, and I would include technology. I think without Amanda, we would be probably lost somewhere in, you know. And also I would like to thank our two graduate students, Leah Hertzun and Devin Drossel, who are always here with us and who are helping us doing the wonderful job that they do. Like they're doing their own magic. So thank you all for being with us today, and we'll see you next time in the spring.